Sometimes the greatest acts of mercy come from those who have suffered the deepest losses. When you've buried everyone you've ever loved, what does it matter if you risk your life for a stranger? Isolde, a widowed healer living alone in an abandoned abbey, finds a dying man in the woods during a violent storm. But this stranger is no ordinary traveler. He's an alpha vampire, hunted by zealots who want him dead. Despite knowing the danger, she chooses to hide him and tend his wounds. As he heals, their conversations reveal shared grief and unexpected understanding. When the hunters return, Isolde must decide if protecting this creature is worth her life. What happens when someone who has nothing left to lose discovers something worth saving? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the stone walls of St. Agatha's Abbey like forgotten prayers, dampening everything it touched with the weight of memory. Isolde pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped through the broken archway that had once welcomed pilgrims from across the kingdom. Now only she walked these corridors, her soft footsteps echoing against walls that had heard confessions, witnessed miracles, and survived the slow death of faith that had claimed so many sacred places in these troubled times. Her healing garden lay behind the abbey, a defiant patch of green life flourishing in the shadow of crumbling towers. She had tended it for nearly 15 years now, ever since she had first sought refuge in this abandoned place. The herbs grew in neat rows despite the wild brambles that pressed against the garden's edges. Chamomile for sleep troubles, willow bark for pain, feverfew for the headaches that plagued the village women. Each plant had been chosen carefully, nurtured with the same gentle persistence that we had once cared for her own children. Marcus would have laughed to see her now, she thought, as she knelt beside the mint patch. Her late husband had always teased her about her stubborn hope, the way she refused to let anything die if she could prevent it. Even the scraggly apple tree that bore bitter fruit each autumn, she had coaxed it back from near death twice, simply because giving up felt like another small betrayal of life itself. The memory of his voice brought its familiar ache, but softer now than in the early years after the plague had taken him. 15 years of solitude had taught her that grief, like her herbs, required careful tending. Left alone, it could overwhelm everything else, but properly cultivated, it became something that nourished rather than destroyed. She gathered the herbs she would need for today's rounds, placing them carefully in the worn leather satchel that had belonged to her mother. The bag had seen 3 generations of healers, her grandmother, her mother, and now herself. Each had added their own remedies to its knowledge, their own understanding of how to ease suffering in a world that seemed determined to create more of it. The village of Millbrook lay an hour's walk through the forest, close enough that she could serve its people, but far enough that she could retreat when their gratitude became too heavy to bear. They called her the Abbey woman, with the careful respect reserved for those who lived outside normal boundaries, not quite hermit, not quite witch, but something in between that commanded both wariness and trust. Thomas would be waiting for her at the village edge, as he had every Wednesday for the past 3 years. The boy was barely 16, all elbows and earnest enthusiasm, but he had proven surprisingly useful as a messenger and assistant. His mother had brought him to Isolde when he was 13, burning with fever and babbling about angels. Whatever had touched his mind during that illness had left him slightly touched ever after, but also strangely perceptive about others' pain. The path through the woods was well worn now, carved by countless trips between abbey and village. Isolde knew every root that might catch an unwary foot, every low branch that required ducking. The forest had become her cathedral in ways the stone abbey never quite managed, alive and breathing, filled with the small miracles of growth and decay that reminded her daily of life's persistence. She paused at the clearing where the path forked, one branch leading to the village, the other toward the deeper woods where few ventured. Something about the morning felt different, charged with the kind of tension that preceded storms. The air hung heavy and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Father Benedict would arrive sometime today, she remembered. The old priest made his irregular visits to check on her welfare and share news from the wider world. Unlike many of his brothers in faith, Benedict had never tried to convince her to return to conventional life. He understood, perhaps better than most, that some wounds required solitude to heal properly. The political situation beyond their peaceful valley had grown more troubling with each of his visits. The new archbishop spoke of purification with the fervor of a man who had never doubted the righteousness of his cause. Supernatural creatures that had once lived quietly on the margins of human society now faced systematic hunting by organized bands of zealots who called themselves the Cleansing Hand. Isolde had treated their victims, humans and others alike, when they managed to reach her sanctuary. The wounds told stories of cruelty that went far beyond simple fear or misunderstanding. These hunters took pleasure in their work, turning persecution into sport. She reached the village as the morning sun burned away the last of the mist. Thomas waited exactly where she expected, perched on the stone wall that marked the village boundary, his face bright with whatever news he carried. "Morning, Lady Isolde," he called, using the title she had long since given up correcting. "Widow Miller's youngest has taken poorly again, and old Henrik's back is paining him something fierce. Oh, and there's been strangers through yesterday, grim-looking fellows with too many weapons and not enough kindness, if you take my meaning." Isolde's step faltered slightly. "What manner of strangers?" "The hunting sort," Thomas said, falling into step beside her. "Asked after creatures and hiding places. Poor Janet's boy made the mistake of mentioning the old abbey, and one of them backhanded him for his trouble. Said holy ground was no place for devil's work." A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air settled in Isolde's chest. The Cleansing Hand rarely traveled this far from major population centers unless they were following specific intelligence. Someone or something had drawn their attention to this region. The morning's routine proceeded as always, checking the Miller child for signs of lung fever, mixing a poultice for Henrik's arthritis, delivering a tonic to help the blacksmith's wife sleep through her husband's snoring. But beneath the familiar rhythm, Isolde found herself listening for sounds that didn't belong, watching for shadows that moved wrong. By afternoon, dark clouds had begun gathering on the western horizon, promising the kind of autumn storm that could turn roads to mud and make travel treacherous. Thomas helped her pack the remaining medicines, his usual chatter subdued by the approaching weather. "You'll be wanting to start back soon," he observed, eyeing the darkening sky. "Looks to be a fierce one brewing." Isolde nodded, but made no move to leave immediately. Something kept her lingering in the village common, some instinct she couldn't quite name. The approaching storm felt like an omen, though whether for good or ill remained unclear. "Thomas," she said finally, "if anyone comes asking after me specifically, not just the abbey woman, but asking for Isolde by name, you send them to Father Benedict first. Let him decide what they ought to know." The boy's eyes sharpened with the peculiar clarity that sometimes seized him. "You're expecting trouble, aren't you? The kind that follows folk like shadows." Before she could answer, the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, with the promise of deluge. Isolde pulled up her hood and started toward home, her thoughts churning like the clouds overhead. The abbey's solid walls had always felt like protection before, but tonight they might need to serve as a fortress. The storm struck in full fury as she reached the forest's edge. Wind howled through the trees with a voice like grief made manifest, and rain drove horizontal across her path. Each step became a struggle against the elements, but Isolde pressed forward with the determination of someone who had weathered worse storms than any nature could provide. Lightning illuminated the woods in stark, momentary clarity, revealing familiar landmarks transformed into alien shapes by wind and water. Thunder followed close behind, rattling her bones and drowning out all other sound. This was the kind of night when sensible people barred their doors and waited for dawn, when only the desperate or the foolish ventured abroad. The abbey's broken towers emerged from the storm like the ribs of some great beast, and Isolde felt a surge of relief at the sight of home. Whatever troubles tomorrow might bring, tonight she would have warmth and safety. Her small fire would chase away the cold, her books would provide companionship, and the morning would bring its own wisdom. She had almost reached the main entrance when lightning flashed again, and she saw something that made her freeze in place. A figure lay crumpled beneath the old oak tree at the forest's edge, human-shaped but utterly still, as if the storm had claimed a victim and deposited the body at her very doorstep. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat into the abbey's protection, to bar the door and wait for morning to reveal whether what she had seen was real or merely a trick of lightning and shadow. But 15 years of healing work had trained other instincts as well, deeper ones that responded to suffering regardless of its source or circumstances. The figure might be a traveler caught by the storm, injured and dying while she debated the wisdom of investigation. Or it might be something else entirely, a trap set by enemies she had not yet made, or a test of the very mercy she had spent her life practicing. Isolde stood in the doorway of her sanctuary, rain streaming from her cloak, and made the choice that would change everything that followed. She stepped back into the storm and walked toward whatever lay beneath the oak tree, carrying nothing but her healing bag and the hope that 15 years of choosing compassion over safety had prepared her for this moment. The wind tried to drive her back, and the rain blinded her, but she pressed forward until she could kneel beside the motionless figure. Lightning revealed enough for her to see that her first impression had been wrong in one crucial detail. This was no ordinary traveler who had fallen victim to the storm. The man beneath the oak tree was dying, but not in any way Isolde had ever witnessed. Blood pooled around his body, dark as wine in the lightning's harsh glare, but it seemed to flow upward rather than seeping into the earth as it should. His skin held a pallor that went beyond mere blood loss, white as fresh snow, with an underlying luminescence that made him appear carved from moonstone rather than born of flesh. She pressed her fingers to his throat, searching for the pulse that would confirm life. What she found instead was something far more complex, a rhythm that felt like heartbeats but came too slowly, too deliberately, as if his body operated by different rules entirely. His breath whispered against her palm when she held it near his lips, but each exhalation carried an unnatural chill that made her shiver despite the storm's warmth. Torn clothing revealed wounds that defied her medical understanding. 3 parallel gashes crossed his chest, too precise to be accidental, too deep to have been survived by any ordinary man. Yet somehow they had begun to seal themselves, the edges pulling together with supernatural determination, even as fresh blood continued to seep from their depths. Around his throat lay the remnants of what had once been a silver amulet. Its chain snapped and the pendant cracked down its center. Strange symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift and writhe in the lightning's intermittent illumination, though that could have been tricks of shadow and storm. Whatever protective power it had once held was clearly broken now, leaving its wearer vulnerable to forces that ordinary silver could not touch. Isolde had heard enough whispered stories to recognize what lay before her. The unnaturally pale skin, the too slow heartbeat, the wounds that healed themselves. This was no human traveler caught by unfortunate weather. This was one of the creatures the cleansing hand hunted with such fervor, one of the beings their new archbishop declared unworthy of mercy or salvation. Everything she had been taught about safety screamed at her to retreat. The abbey's walls would protect her if she could reach them quickly enough. By morning, the storm would have washed away all evidence of what she had found, and she could return to her quiet life of tending herbs and healing villagers who appreciated her skill without questioning its limits. But as she knelt in the rain beside this impossible being, Other memories surfaced. The hunter who had backhanded young Jamie for mentioning the abbey. The systematic cruelty Father Benedict described in his reports from the wider world. The fear in Thomas's eyes when he spoke of strangers asking about hiding places. How different was this wounded creature from any other victim of violence she had treated over the years. The nature of his injuries suggested he had been attacked by multiple assailants, likely the same hunters who had terrorized the village. If their cruelty extended to torturing the dying rather than granting clean deaths, what did that say about their supposed righteousness? The decision crystallized in her mind with the same clarity that had once guided her through difficult childbirths and desperate fevers. This being needed help, and she possessed the skills to provide it. The rest, questions of wisdom, safety, and consequence, could wait until he was no longer in immediate danger of death. Lifting him proved more challenging than anticipated. Despite his lean build, he possessed the dense weight of stone rather than flesh. She managed to get his arm across her shoulders and half drag, half carry him toward the abbey, stopping frequently to adjust her grip and catch her breath. The storm provided cover for their slow progress, driving any potential observers to seek shelter rather than witness her rescue of the very type of being they would consider an abomination. The abbey's main hall had not been designed as a sick room, but Isolde had prepared makeshift medical facilities there before. She dragged him to the space near the altar, where broken windows provided the best natural light during daylight hours, and began the familiar ritual of assessment and treatment. His wounds required cleaning before she could properly evaluate their extent. The water in her basin steamed when she dipped the cloth, though she had drawn it cold from the well. His skin felt like touching winter itself, so cold it burned her fingertips, yet the blood that flowed from his injuries ran warm as any human's. As she worked, cleaning away dirt and dried blood to reveal the true damage, he stirred occasionally, never fully conscious, but aware enough to murmur words in languages she didn't recognize. Some sounded like Latin, others like nothing that had ever been spoken by human tongues. Once, when her ministrations caused particular pain, his eyes snapped open to reveal irises the color of storm clouds, silver-gray and swirling with their own inner weather. "Be still," she whispered, the same tone she had once used to comfort her fevered children. "You're safe now. I won't let them hurt you anymore." Whether he understood her words or simply responded to her tone, the tension left his body and his eyes drifted closed again. But not before she caught something in his expression that surprised her, not gratitude, which she might have expected, but wonder, as if her simple kindness represented something he had not encountered in so long he had forgotten its existence. The worst of his wounds lay across his ribs, where something with claws had tried to open him from sternum to spine. The edges showed signs of cauterization, as if his attackers had heated their weapons before use. This spoke to a level of premeditation and cruelty that made her stomach clench with righteous anger. She cleaned and dressed each injury with the same care she would have shown any patient, using techniques learned from her mother and refined through years of practice. His supernatural nature might make conventional treatment less effective, but it could hardly make things worse, and the fundamental principles of healing remained constant across species. By the time she finished, dawn had begun to struggle through the storm clouds. Her patient's breathing had grown stronger, more regular, and some color had returned to his otherworldly features. The immediate crisis had passed, but deeper challenges lay ahead. Hiding his presence would prove difficult once normal activity resumed. Father Benedict would arrive sometime today, and while she trusted the Sebastian, old priest's discretion, involving him in actively concealing a supernatural being, might test his conscience beyond its limits. The village children would expect her usual Wednesday visits, and any change in routine might draw unwanted attention. More pressing was the question of her patient's nature and intentions. The stories told about his kind painted them as predators who viewed humans as livestock at best. Yet something about his circumstances suggested he was as much victim as threat. The hunters who had wounded him so severely would not have wasted such effort on a creature who posed no challenge to their activities. She found herself studying his face as he slept, searching for signs of the monster she had been taught to fear. What she saw instead was exhaustion that went beyond physical weariness, the bone-deep fatigue of someone who had carried burdens too heavy for too long. Lines around his eyes spoke of pain that predated his current injuries, and his hands, when she examined them for additional wounds, showed calluses that suggested honest labor rather than a life of predatory ease. The sun was fully risen by the time he showed signs of waking. His eyes opened slowly, awareness returning in stages as he took in his surroundings. When his gaze found her sitting nearby, he went very still, not the stillness of sleep, but the frozen alertness of prey, suddenly aware of a predator's presence. "Peace," Isolde said softly, holding up empty hands to show she meant no threat. "You're in St. Agatha's Abbey. You were badly injured, but you're healing now." He studied her with those unsettling storm-grey eyes, and she could practically see his mind working through the implications of his situation. A supernatural being, wounded and vulnerable, in the care of a human who should by rights have left him to die, or summoned hunters to finish what they had started. Why? The single word carried layers of meaning. Why had she helped him? Why was she still here? Why was she not afraid? Isolde considered her answer carefully. The truth was complex, rooted in principles she was not sure she could articulate clearly. "Because you needed help," she said finally, "and because I have spent too many years watching cruelty triumph over mercy." Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to cautious hope. He tried to sit up, winced at the pull of healing wounds, and settled for raising himself on one elbow. "You don't know what I am," he said, his voice carrying the faint accent of someone for whom English was a learned rather than native tongue. "I know enough," Isolde replied. "You're a being in pain, far from whatever home you might claim, hunted by people who take pleasure in others' suffering. Everything else is detail." He stared at her for a long moment, and she wondered if she had revealed too much of her own loneliness in that simple statement. Then, impossibly, he smiled, an expression so warm and genuine it transformed his entire face. "My name is Alaric," he said, "and I believe I owe you my life." The first 3 days passed in a careful dance of wariness and necessity. Alaric remained weak enough that he posed no immediate threat, while Isolde found herself adjusting to the reality of sharing her sanctuary with a being whose very existence challenged everything she thought she understood about the world. Her mornings began before dawn, when she would check his wounds and change his dressings by candlelight. The supernatural healing continued to amaze her. Injuries that should have taken weeks to close were sealing themselves in days, leaving only thin silver lines to mark where violence had nearly claimed his life. Yet the process clearly demanded enormous energy from his body, leaving him sleeping 16 hours out of every 24. During his waking periods, their conversations remained cautious and superficial. He thanked her repeatedly for her care, inquired politely about the Abbey's history, and answered her questions about his condition with the careful precision of someone who had learned to reveal nothing without specific intent. She found herself studying him when he thought she wasn't looking, searching for signs of the predatory nature she had been taught to expect. What she observed instead was restraint. When she brought him food, simple broths and bread that his weakened state could tolerate, he ate with deliberate slowness, as if demonstrating that he possessed perfect control over appetites others of his kind might find overwhelming. When she moved close enough to check his injuries, he held himself absolutely still, ensuring that no sudden movement might startle or threaten her. It was the behavior of someone who had learned to make himself as unthreatening as possible, and that realization sparked uncomfortable questions about his past experiences with human contact. On the third evening, as rain drummed against the abbeys, Broken windows, Isolde made a decision that surprised even herself. She climbed to the small chamber above the altar, where she kept her most precious possessions, books that had belonged to her mother and grandmother, volumes that contained knowledge too dangerous for ordinary practice. Her family had served as healers for generations, and each woman had added to their accumulated wisdom. Some of that knowledge dealt with conventional medicine, but other passages addressed healing needs that arose only rarely, treatments for supernatural ailments, remedies that worked on beings whose bodies operated by different rules than human physiology. She had never expected to need such information herself. These books had always felt like historical curiosities, remnants of a time when the boundaries between natural and supernatural had been more permeable. Now, as she carried them down to where Alaric rested, she wondered if her ancestors had somehow known that one day their carefully preserved wisdom would mean the difference between life and death for someone under her care. "What are those?" Alaric asked, noting the careful way she handled the leather-bound volumes. "Medical texts," Isolde replied, settling herself on a cushion near his makeshift bed. "Some conventional, others that deal with healing needs that arise less frequently." His eyes sharpened with interest. "You have knowledge of supernatural medicine?" "My grandmother did. She passed it to my mother, who passed it to me. I've never had occasion to use most of it, but—" She gestured toward his healing wounds. "Your body seems to respond differently than human physiology. I thought these might help me better understand how to assist your recovery." Alaric attempted to sit up, winced, and settled for propping himself against the stone wall. "May I see them?" Isolde hesitated. These books contained more than just medical knowledge. They held family secrets, techniques that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. But watching him struggle with injuries that conventional treatment couldn't fully address, she found her protective instincts extending beyond her books to encompass the wounded being who had come to depend on her care. She opened the oldest volume, its pages yellow with age and careful handling. The text was written in her great-grandmother's precise script, mixing Latin with symbols that predated any formal medical training. "This passage discusses accelerated healing in beings with supernatural constitutions," she said, finding the relevant section. "It suggests that certain herbs can support the process without interfering with natural regeneration." As she read aloud, she watched his expression change from polite interest to genuine surprise. "Your ancestor treated others like me, apparently." The entries suggest she helped several supernatural beings over the course of her practice. She writes about different species, different healing needs. Isolde paused, realizing the implications of her words. She treated them as patients, not as threats. "That's remarkable," Alaric said quietly. "In my experience, most humans who possess knowledge of supernatural healing use it for purposes of harm rather than help. The hunters who—" He stopped himself, but not before she caught the pain that flickered across his features. "They used medical knowledge to torture you," Isolde finished, the pieces falling into place. "That's why your wounds were cauterized. They wanted to prevent your natural healing while they tried to extract information about my kind's weaknesses." Yes, his voice remained level, but she could see the effort it cost him to maintain that composure. "They had studied us extensively. Their methods were quite sophisticated." The casual way he spoke of such cruelty made her stomach clench with sympathetic anger. "How long did they hold you?" 3 days. Perhaps 4 time becomes difficult to measure. Under such circumstances, he met her eyes directly. "They released me not from mercy, but because they had learned what they sought. I was of no further use to them. But you escaped." "I was discarded," he corrected gently, "left in the forest to die slowly rather than granted a clean death. They found my suffering entertaining." Isolde closed the book and set it carefully aside. "I'm sorry." No being deserves such treatment, regardless of their nature. Something in her tone must have conveyed the depth of her sincerity, because his carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "You truly mean that?" "I do." "Why?" The question carried genuine bewilderment. "You know what I am. You must have heard stories about my kind, our appetites, our capacity for violence. Why extend such compassion to a creature you should rightly fear?" Isolde considered her answer carefully. "Because I've learned that the capacity for cruelty isn't limited to any particular species. The men who tortured you were human, but their actions were far more monstrous than anything you've shown me." She paused, thinking of Marcus and her children, of the plague that had taken them despite all her healing knowledge. "And because I've lost too much to waste time fearing what might happen when I could instead try to do some good with what time remains to me." Alaric studied her face with those storm-grey eyes. "You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Hatred? Fear? Or perhaps greed? Some humans see my kind as sources of power to be exploited. I certainly didn't expect someone who would risk her safety to heal injuries she had no obligation to treat. Then perhaps we've both encountered poor examples of each other's species," Isolde said. "Would you like me to continue reading? This section discusses dietary supplements that might help restore your strength more quickly." He nodded, settling back against the wall with something approaching relaxation for the first time since she had found him. As she read from her grandmother's careful notes about supernatural physiology, she found herself thinking about the assumptions they had both carried into this unexpected encounter. The man, listening with such careful attention to her words, bore no resemblance to the monsters described in popular stories. His questions were thoughtful, his gratitude genuine, and his restraint in her presence spoke of someone who had learned to value trust as a rare and precious commodity. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against stone walls that had sheltered countless souls over the centuries. Inside the abbey's warm shadows, two beings who should have been enemies by nature found themselves discovering the possibility of something far more complex and hopeful. As the evening deepened and candlelight flickered across ancient stones, Isolde began to understand that rescuing Alaric had changed more than just his circumstances. It had opened a door in her own carefully ordered world, revealing possibilities she had never imagined and challenging assumptions she had held for decades. The question that remained was whether either of them possessed the courage to step through that door and discover what lay beyond. By the end of the first week, Alaric had grown strong enough to move about the abbey with careful deliberation. Isolde found him one morning in what had once been the monastery's workshop, examining the collection of wood-carving tools that Marcus had left behind. The morning light, streaming through broken windows, caught the dust motes that danced around his still figure, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the abandoned space. "These are beautifully crafted," he said without turning, his fingers tracing the smooth handle of a carving knife with obvious appreciation. "The balance is perfect, and the steel holds a remarkable edge despite their age." Isolde paused in the doorway, struck by the sight of his long fingers handling Marcus's tools with the same reverence her husband had shown them. "They belonged to my husband. He was a master carpenter before the plague took him." "I'm sorry." Alaric set the tool down carefully and turned to face her. "I didn't mean to intrude on private memories." "You're not intruding." She moved into the room, running her own hand along the workbench where Marcus had spent countless hours creating beauty from rough wood. "Actually, I'm glad someone appreciates their quality. They've been gathering dust for 15 years. He taught you something of the craft?" Alaric asked, noting the familiarity with which she handled the tools. "Basic techniques. I was never truly skilled, but Marcus insisted I understand the fundamentals. He said good tools deserved to be used by hands that respected their purpose." She picked up a small chisel, remembering the weight of it in Marcus's larger hands as he guided her through her first clumsy attempts at carving. "These Walls could use some repair work, actually. The winter storms have loosened several stones, and some of the window frames are rotting through. Something shifted in Alaric's expression, a brightening that transformed his features from merely handsome to genuinely compelling. I could help with that, if you'd trust me with the tools. I have some experience with stonework and carpentry. You do? When you've lived as long as I have, you accumulate various skills. I spent several decades working as a stonemason in the Italian city-states during what you humans call the Renaissance. Before that, I learned carpentry from a master craftsman in the forests of Germania. He gestured toward a section of wall where mortar had crumbled away. These techniques are familiar to me, though the specific challenges of maintaining a building this old require careful consideration. The idea of sharing this work, of having another set of skilled hands to help preserve her sanctuary, appealed to Isolde more than she had expected. You're certain you're strong enough? Your wounds are healing remarkably well, thanks to your care and your grandmother's wisdom. He flexed his shoulders experimentally. The work would actually help strengthen muscles that have grown stiff from too much rest. They began that afternoon with an assessment of the abbey's most pressing needs. Alaric moved through the building with an architect's eye, noting structural weaknesses and potential solutions with the confidence of long experience. His suggestions were practical and thoughtful, designed to preserve the abbey's character while ensuring its continued habitability. Working alongside him revealed aspects of his personality that their careful conversations had only hinted at. He approached each task with methodical precision, but also with a deep appreciation for craftsmanship that spoke of someone who found genuine satisfaction in creating rather than destroying. When they discovered a section of carved stonework that had been damaged by weather, he spent nearly an hour studying the original artisan's technique before attempting repairs. The mason who created this had exceptional skill, he observed, running his fingers over intricate vine patterns that wound around a window frame. See how each leaf is slightly different, yet the overall design maintains perfect symmetry? This is work that demands not just technical ability, but genuine artistic vision. Can you recreate it? I can try. It will require time and patience, but yes, I believe I can restore it to something approaching its original beauty. As they worked, their conversations naturally deepened beyond the polite exchanges that had characterized his recovery period. Alaric spoke of the places he had seen over his long existence, describing architectural marvels and artistic achievements with the enthusiasm of someone who had witnessed their creation firsthand. In return, Isolde found herself sharing stories of her life with Marcus, memories she had kept locked away for years, emerging naturally in response to his thoughtful questions. He sounds like a remarkable man, Alaric said, as they paused for the midday meal she had prepared. Someone who understood that true craftsmanship requires both skill and heart. He was, Isolde agreed, surprised to find that speaking of Marcus brought warmth rather than the familiar ache of loss. He would have liked you, I think. He appreciated anyone who approached their work with genuine dedication, even if that someone happened to be a creature most humans consider an abomination. The question was asked lightly, but Isolde caught the underlying tension in his voice. Marcus judged people by their actions, not their nature. If he had seen you working to preserve rather than destroy, treating his tools with respect rather than carelessness, yes, he would have appreciated that regardless of what you are. Something in Alaric's expression suggested that such acceptance was rare in his experience. Your husband was fortunate to have found someone who shares his capacity for looking beyond surface appearances. We were fortunate in each other, Isolde corrected. Marriage isn't just about finding someone perfect, it's about finding someone whose imperfections complement your own. They worked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the rhythm of shared labor creating its own form of communication. When Alaric needed a particular tool, Isolde anticipated the request and placed it within his reach. When she struggled with a section of damaged mortar, he offered guidance without making her feel incompetent. By late afternoon, they had made visible progress on several repairs, but more importantly, they had established a partnership that felt both natural and significant. Watching Alaric carefully restore damaged stonework with tools that had belonged to her husband created an unexpected sense of continuity, as if Marcus's legacy was being honored by hands he would never have expected to hold it. "There's something I should tell you," Alaric said as they cleaned the tools at the end of the day, "about why those hunters were so determined to capture me alive." Isolde paused in her cleaning of a chisel, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal would change the comfortable dynamic they had established. "What is it?" "I wasn't just a random target. They sought me specifically because I possess information they believe valuable knowledge about my kind's activities and weaknesses." He set down the tool he had been cleaning and met her eyes directly. "By sheltering me, you've made yourself a target as well." The practical part of her mind recognized the danger this represented, but a deeper part of her consciousness had already accepted that risk days ago when she chose to bring him to safety. "Are they likely to find us here?" "Eventually, yes. My trail was difficult to possess today. Follow in the storm, but not impossible. They will search systematically until they locate where I've taken refuge." "How long do we have?" "Days, perhaps a week or two at most. They are persistent, and they have resources at their disposal that make hiding increasingly difficult." Isolde nodded slowly, processing this information. "Then we'd best make good use of whatever time remains." Her calm acceptance of the danger seemed to surprise him. "You're not afraid?" "I'm terrified," she admitted honestly. "But fear has never been a particularly useful emotion in a crisis. We have work to do and limited time to complete it. Panic won't improve our circumstances." Alaric smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him. "You really are remarkable." "I'm practical," she corrected, but found herself returning his smile with unexpected warmth. "Now, help me put these tools away properly. Marcus always said that good tools deserved good care, and I suspect we'll need them again tomorrow." The second week brought unseasonably warm weather that felt like a reprieve from autumn's advance. But it also brought an inner turmoil that Isolde found increasingly difficult to ignore. She would catch herself watching Alaric as he worked, admiring the graceful economy of his movements, the way afternoon light caught the silver in his dark hair, the rare smile that transformed his serious features into something approaching breathtaking. Such thoughts felt like a betrayal of everything she had built her life around for the past 15 years. The small chamber above the altar where she slept still contained Marcus's few remaining possessions, and among them lay her mother's illuminated prayer book, a beautiful manuscript decorated with gold leaf and intricate marginalia that had guided 3 generations of women through their spiritual struggles. She found herself turning to it more frequently now, seeking guidance for questions that had no clear answers. Was it possible to honor the memory of a beloved husband while acknowledging attraction to someone else? Could feelings that seemed to grow stronger each day be reconciled with faith that taught supernatural beings existed outside divine grace? And most troubling of all, was she fooling herself about the nature of what she felt, mistaking gratitude and fascination for something deeper and more dangerous? The prayer book offered comfort through familiar verses, but it also reminded her of conversations with her mother about the complexities of love and loss. "The heart has its own wisdom," her mother had once said during Isolde's difficult courtship with Marcus. "Sometimes that wisdom conflicts with what the mind believes it knows. The challenge is learning to trust both without letting either dominate completely." Alaric seemed to sense her internal struggle, though he gave no direct indication of awareness. Their conversations during the day remained focused on practical matters, the abbey's repairs, Her continuing education in supernatural healing, his careful observations about the world's changes over his long existence. But she caught him studying her, sometimes with an intensity that suggested his own thoughts had wandered into complicated territory. On Wednesday morning, as she prepared for her routine visit to the village, he surprised her by expressing concern about her continued exposure to potential danger. Perhaps it would be wiser to suspend these visits until the immediate threat has passed, he suggested, watching her pack medicines into her worn leather satchel. If the hunters have associates in the area, your movements might be observed and reported. The children need their treatments, Isolde replied, though she appreciated his concern. Young Jamie has been fighting a recurring fever, and the blacksmith's wife requires her sleeping draught. I can't abandon my responsibilities simply because danger might exist. Your sense of duty is admirable, but nothing, she interrupted gently. This is who I am, Alaric. I'm a healer. If I stop healing because of fear, then I've already lost everything that matters. Something in her tone must have conveyed the depth of her conviction, because he nodded slowly. Then allow me to accompany you. I can remain hidden while you tend your patients, but I'll be close enough to provide assistance if trouble arises. The offer sparked a conflict between her desire for his protection and her awareness of the additional risk his presence would represent. That doubles the danger for both of us. It also doubles our ability to respond to threats, he countered. I've spent centuries avoiding hunters, and my senses are considerably more acute than human perception. I can detect approaching danger long before you would be aware of it. His logic was sound, but accepting his protection felt like crossing another invisible line in their relationship. She would be. Acknowledging not just her growing trust in him, but also her willingness to be vulnerable in his presence, to admit that she no longer saw him as a potential threat, but as someone whose safety mattered to her. Very well, she agreed finally. But you stay hidden unless absolutely necessary. The walk to the village proceeded without incident. Though Alaric's presence, invisible but somehow palpable, made her acutely aware of her surroundings in new ways. She found herself noting potential hiding places, escape routes, and defensive positions with the kind of tactical thinking that felt completely foreign to her normal mindset. Thomas waited at his usual spot, but his customary cheerfulness was subdued. "Morning, Lady Isolde. Trust you've been keeping well?" "Well enough. What news from the village?" "Nothing good, I'm afraid. Those grim fellows passed through again yesterday, asking more pointed questions about strangers and supernatural creatures. They seemed particularly interested in anyone who might be harboring such beings." His eyes held a warning that went beyond his casual words. Folk are getting nervous about associations that might be misunderstood. The implication was clear: her continued safety might depend on maintaining the appearance of complete normalcy. Any deviation from her established routines could attract unwanted attention from people who viewed compassion as potential evidence of corruption. Her rounds that morning felt different, shadowed by awareness of hidden observation from multiple sources. Alaric remained invisible, but she sensed his presence like a warm spot against her consciousness. Meanwhile, the villagers watched her with new wariness, their gratitude for her healing skills now tempered by fear of association with anyone the hunters might consider suspicious. Young Jamie's fever had worsened, requiring stronger remedies than conventional herbs could provide. As she mixed a potion that included ingredients from her supernatural medical supplies, she wondered if using such knowledge made her guilty of the corruption the hunters sought to eliminate. Was there truly a difference between healing magic and harmful sorcery, or was it merely a matter of intention and application? The blacksmith's wife presented a different challenge. Her sleeping troubles stemmed from recurring nightmares about supernatural creatures attacking the village, fears that had intensified since the hunters' visits. Isolde found herself in the strange position of treating anxiety caused by fear of beings like the one she was protecting, dispensing comfort for terrors that might prove prophetic if her sanctuary were discovered. As the day progressed, she became increasingly aware of the complexity of her position. Every act of healing now carried additional layers of meaning, every conversation held potential for dangerous revelation, and every moment of genuine human connection reminded her of how much she had to lose. The return journey to the abbey took place in thoughtful silence. Alaric emerged from concealment only when they reached the forest's edge, his expression grave with whatever he had observed during their expedition. "The village is more nervous than you indicated," he said without preamble. "Fear has made them suspicious of each other as well as outsiders. That kind of atmosphere makes discovery more likely, not less." "I noticed," Isolde agreed. "But what choice do we have? Isolation makes me equally suspicious in their eyes." "We could leave," he said quietly. "Find sanctuary elsewhere, perhaps with others who share our unusual circumstances." The suggestion hit her like a physical blow. Leave the abbey that had been her home for 15 years, abandon the villagers who depended on her care, give up the life she had built from the ruins of her earlier loss. "This is my home," she said firmly. "I won't be driven from it by fear, even if staying might cost both our lives." She turned to face him fully, seeing her own determination reflected in his storm-grey eyes. "Even then, some things are worth the risk." Alaric studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we make our stand here, whatever the cost." "Together," she agreed, the word carrying more weight than she had intended. "Together," he confirmed, and the way he said it made her heart skip in patterns that had nothing to do with fear. 3 days later, Thomas arrived at the abbey before dawn, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by urgent concern. Isolde found him pacing near the main entrance, clutching her worn leather satchel, the healer's bag that had served 3 generations of women in her family and now carried medicines that might be the difference between life and death for the village children. "Lady Isolde, thank the saints you're here," he gasped, relief evident in his voice. "It's the children, 6 of them now, burning with fever, and nothing we've tried has helped. Widow Miller's youngest is—" his voice broke slightly. "We fear she won't see another sunset without proper treatment." Isolde's healer instincts immediately overrode all other considerations. "How long have they been ill?" 2 days for the first, but it's spreading fast. The blacksmith's boy took sick overnight, and little Sarah can barely keep her eyes open." Thomas wrung his hands desperately. "The village midwife says she's never seen anything like it. We need you, my lady. The children need you." From behind her came the soft sound of approaching footsteps. Alaric emerged from the shadows of the abbey, fully dressed and alert despite the early hour. Over the past days, his supernatural senses had made him aware of approaching visitors long before human ears could detect them. "What kind of fever?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed countless plagues across centuries of existence. Thomas started at the unexpected presence of a stranger, but desperation overcame wariness. "Burns like fire, but they shiver like they're freezing. Their breathing comes harsh and labored, and some are speaking words that make no sense, languages none of us recognize." Alaric's expression darkened with recognition. "That's not a natural illness. It sounds like magical poisoning, possibly from contaminated water or food sources." "Magical?" Thomas's eyes widened with fear. "But how? We're just simple folk." "The hunters who passed through your village," Alaric interrupted. "They may have introduced something into your water supply or food stores. Some zealots believe that making an area uninhabitable for supernatural beings requires poisoning it against all forms of magical influence, including the natural healing abilities that help children fight off serious illness." The implications hit Isolde like a physical blow. The hunters weren't just seeking supernatural creatures, they were actively harming innocent humans in their quest for purification. Children were dying because of a conflict they couldn't understand, victims of hatred that had nothing to do with their own actions or beliefs. "I have to go to them," she said, already moving toward her medical supplies. If this is magical poisoning, conventional treatments won't be enough. I'll need the supernatural remedies from your grandmother's texts, Alaric finished, which means using ingredients and techniques that will mark you as practicing forbidden arts if observed. I don't care about the risk to myself. Those are children suffering. And I'm not suggesting you abandon them, he said firmly, but this mission will be considerably more dangerous than your usual village visits. If the hunters are still in the area and they observe you using supernatural healing methods, then we'll have to ensure they don't observe. Isolde interrupted, her mind already working through the logistical challenges. Can you help with that? Alaric nodded slowly. I can provide protection and concealment, yes. But once we begin treating magical poisoning with supernatural remedies, there's no hiding what we're doing. From anyone with knowledge to recognize it, we'll be committed to a course of action that marks us both as enemies of the Church's purification efforts. Thomas looked between them with growing understanding. You're, that is. He's. The boy swallowed hard, then straightened his shoulders with surprising courage. I don't care what either of you are, if you can help the children. They're innocent in all of this. The simple declaration of moral clarity from someone barely past childhood himself shamed Isolde for even hesitating. Gather what medicines you think we'll need, she told Alaric. I'll prepare the specialized treatments. They worked with efficient coordination, Isolde mixing remedies that combined conventional herbs with ingredients that could counteract magical contamination, while Alaric selected tools and supplies that might be needed for more serious intervention. The leather satchel that had carried her family's healing tradition for generations now held their best hope of saving children whose only crime was living in a village that had attracted the wrong kind of attention. The journey to the village took place in tense silence, both of them alert for signs of hidden observers. Alaric's supernatural senses provided early warning of potential threats, while Isolde's intimate knowledge of the local terrain allowed them to approach the village by routes that offered maximum concealment. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. 6 children lay desperately ill, their small bodies racked by fever that resisted all conventional treatment. Worse, their symptoms were clearly supernatural in origin, temperatures that should have caused death but didn't, delirium that included speaking in ancient languages they couldn't possibly know, and a strange luminescence beneath their skin that suggested their life force was being drained away by whatever had poisoned them. Working together, Isolde and Alaric began the complex process of magical detoxification. She administered remedies that her grandmother's texts promised could neutralize supernatural contamination, while he used abilities she was only beginning to understand to draw the poisonous influence away from the children's bodies. The process was exhausting for both of them, requiring intense concentration and physical contact that felt surprisingly intimate despite the clinical nature of their work. When Alaric placed his hands on a child's fevered forehead to drain away magical poison, Isolde found herself supporting him with her own touch, their combined efforts creating something more powerful than either could achieve alone. By late afternoon, 5 of the 6 children showed clear signs of improvement. Their fevers broke, their breathing eased, and the strange luminescence beneath their skin began to fade. But the youngest widow miller's daughter remained trapped in whatever nightmare the poisoning had created for her. I can't reach her, Alaric said finally, exhaustion clear in his voice. The contamination has gone too deep, created too strong a hold. She needs something more than I can provide. Isolde looked down at the small girl, who reminded her so strongly of her own daughter at that age. Without conscious decision, she found herself taking the child's hand and opening her heart to whatever healing power she possessed, not just medical knowledge or supernatural technique, but the pure intention to preserve life regardless of personal cost. The connection that formed between them was unlike anything she had experienced before. Through her touch flowed not just healing energy, but something deeper, love, determination, and the fierce protective instinct that had once made her a devoted mother and now made her a healer who would risk everything for those under her care. When the child's eyes opened and focused clearly for the first time in days, Isolde felt tears of relief streaming down her face. But she also felt Alaric's hand on her shoulder, steadying her as the effort of what she had done left her swaying with exhaustion. "That was remarkable," he said quietly, his voice carrying wonder and something deeper that made her heart race. "You didn't just heal her, you brought her back from the edge of death itself." "We brought her back," Isolde corrected, acutely aware of his touch and the way it seemed to complete something inside her that had been incomplete for far too long. Their eyes met over the sleeping child, and in that moment, the careful boundaries they had maintained collapsed entirely. Without words, they acknowledged what had been building between them, not just attraction or gratitude, but something profound enough to risk everything they had built their lives around. The sound of approaching horses shattered their moment of connection, reminding them both that healing the children had been only the first challenge of this dangerous day. The approaching horses belonged not to hunters, but to Father Benedict, whose arrival at the village brought both relief and an urgency that immediately put Isolde on guard. The elderly priest dismounted with unusual haste, his normally composed features tight with concern as he hurried toward the house where they had been treating the children. "Isolde, thank God I found you," he said without preamble, then stopped short as his gaze fell upon Alaric. For a moment, the two men studied each other with the careful assessment of those who recognize something significant in the encounter. "Father Benedict," Isolde said carefully, "this is Alaric. He's been helping me treat the children's illness." "Indeed." Benedict's voice carried neither condemnation nor surprise, but something far more complex, and doing so with considerable skill, from what I observed of your work together. The casual way he spoke of observing supernatural healing techniques sent a chill through Isolde's consciousness. "You were watching us?" "I've been watching this village since the hunters first passed through," Benedict replied, his attention still focused on Alaric, "waiting to see what their true purpose might be, and hoping I would arrive in time to prevent the worst outcomes." Alaric straightened slightly, his supernatural senses clearly detecting something in the priest's manner that human perception might miss. "You know what I am." "I know exactly what you are," Benedict confirmed, "just as I know that your presence here is no coincidence, and that the children's illness was deliberately induced to flush out exactly the kind of supernatural activity we just witnessed." The implications of his words struck Isolde like ice water. "The hunters poisoned the children as bait?" "A trap, yes, though not for him." Specifically, Benedict gestured toward Alaric. "They're seeking evidence of a larger network, supernatural beings and their human allies, working together to undermine the Church's purification efforts." "A network that exists?" Alaric asked. Benedict smiled grimly and reached inside his robes, withdrawing a folded letter bearing an ecclesiastical seal that looked both official and somehow secretive. "A network that exists, has been operating for nearly a decade, and is about to face its greatest crisis since its formation." He handed the letter to Isolde, who opened it with trembling fingers. The text was written in Benedict's careful script, but the content revealed a reality she had never suspected existed. Asterisk. "To our brothers and sisters in sanctuary work, the cleansing hand has accelerated their operations beyond our ability to provide adequate warning. Safe houses in Canterbury, York, and Winchester have been compromised. We estimate 43 supernatural refugees, currently in hiding throughout our network, with perhaps a dozen human allies providing direct assistance. The Archbishop's forces now include individuals with supernatural detection abilities, making concealment increasingly difficult. All sanctuaries should prepare for immediate evacuation if circumstances require it. The cause is just, but the cost grows higher with each passing month." Asterisk. "You've been hiding supernatural beings," Isolde said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For years," Benedict confirmed. A network of priests, healers, and ordinary citizens who believe that divine mercy extends beyond the boundaries of species. We provide safe passage, medical treatment, and sanctuary for those fleeing persecution. Why? Alaric's question carried genuine bewilderment. Your church officially considers my kind to be abominations. Why risk your position, your life, to help us? Because I've seen too much evidence that the capacity for good or evil exists in all sentient beings, regardless of their origin, Benedict replied. I've known vampires who spent centuries protecting human communities, and humans who took pleasure in torturing innocents. Salvation is not determined by what someone is, but by how they choose to live. The radical nature of this theology struck Isolde as both shocking and somehow inevitable. She had spent years watching Benedict minister to the village with genuine compassion, never judging those who sought help, regardless of their circumstances. That such mercy would extend to supernatural beings made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of his consistent character. The letter mentions detection abilities, she said, rereading the relevant passage. What does that mean? The cleansing hand has recruited individuals with supernatural heritage who use their abilities to hunt others of their kind, Benedict explained. Half-blood vampires, humans with magical sensitivity, even reformed demons seeking redemption through service to the church. They can identify supernatural signatures that would remain hidden from purely human hunters. Alaric's expression darkened with recognition. That explains how they found me so easily. I assumed they had simply tracked my physical trail, but if they have supernatural assistance, they'll find you again, Benedict finished. Which brings me to why I sought you out. We're planning an evacuation of all compromised sanctuaries, but it requires coordination and specific intelligence about hunter movements and capabilities. What kind of intelligence? Isolde asked, though she suspected the answer would complicate their situation considerably. Alaric possesses something the network desperately needs, Benedict said. Information about the hunter's true leadership and ultimate objectives. You see, the Cleansing Hand isn't simply a religious organization seeking to purify the world of supernatural influence. He paused, allowing the weight of implication to settle before continuing. They're a political operation designed to eliminate supernatural beings who might oppose certain powerful interests. The Church's involvement provides moral cover for activities that have nothing to do with spiritual purification. What kind of powerful interests? Alaric asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to expect the worst from human politics. Vampire lords who have made alliances with corrupt church officials, trading information about their own kind in exchange for protection and expanded territory, Benedict replied. The systematic elimination of independent supernatural beings serves their interests by removing potential rivals and resistance. The revelation recontextualized everything Isolde thought she understood about the persecution they faced. This wasn't religious zealotry run amok, but calculated political maneuvering disguised as holy mission. How do you know all this? She demanded. Because some of the supernatural refugees we've helped possess detailed knowledge of these arrangements, Benedict said, including testimony about specific meetings between church officials and vampire nobility that Alaric witnessed personally. All eyes turned to Alaric, whose expression had gone carefully blank in the way that suggested powerful emotions held under rigid control. You know about the conclave. We know that you attended a gathering where arrangements were made to eliminate supernatural beings who refused to acknowledge vampire authority, Benedict confirmed. We know that your refusal to participate in those arrangements led to your exile and eventual capture by the hunters. And we know that your testimony could expose the entire conspiracy, at the cost of my life, certainly, Alaric said, and likely the lives of anyone associated with me. Perhaps, Benedict agreed, But without that testimony, the persecution will continue indefinitely. More children will be poisoned, more innocents will die, and the corruption will spread until it encompasses the entire church hierarchy. Isolde found herself caught between competing loyalties and moral imperatives. Protecting Alaric had become central to her sense of purpose, but the broader implications of the network's mission demanded consideration as well. How many lives might be saved by exposing the conspiracy? How many children might avoid the kind of suffering they had just witnessed? "There's something else," Benedict added quietly. "The hunters know about this abbey. They know about your relationship with Alaric, and they're planning a major operation to capture both of you within the next few days." "How do you know that?" "Because I've been in communication with other network members who have contacts among the hunters' human allies," he explained. "The trap with the children was only the beginning. They're gathering forces for what they call a final cleansing of this region, the Five." The scope of the danger they faced had expanded beyond anything Isolde had imagined. Not only were their lives at immediate risk, but their choices could affect the survival of an entire underground network of people working to protect the innocent. "What are you asking us to do?" she said finally. "Help us coordinate the evacuation," Benedict replied. "Alaric's knowledge of supernatural capabilities and hunter tactics could save dozens of lives. Your medical expertise could help treat refugees who arrive injured or ill. Together, you could make a significant difference in how many people survive what's coming." "And if we refuse?" Alaric asked. "Then you face the hunters alone, while others die who might have lived with your help," Benedict said without judgment. "I won't pretend the choice is simple or that either path offers safety, but at least working with the network provides purpose beyond mere survival." Isolde looked at Alaric, seeing her own internal struggle reflected in his storm-grey eyes. They had found something precious together in their sanctuary, but keeping it might require sacrificing principles that had defined both their lives. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked. "Until tomorrow morning," Benedict replied. "After that, events will move too quickly for careful consideration." As the priest departed with promises to return at dawn, Isolde and Alaric faced the most crucial decision either had confronted in decades: whether love was worth preserving at any cost, or whether some things were worth risking, even love itself. The decision came to them during the darkest hour before dawn, when even the bravest souls question their resolve and the weight of consequence feels heaviest. Isolde and Alaric had spent the night in the abbey's main hall, sitting together in the space where she had first tended his wounds, surrounded by the tools and medicines that had brought them together. "We can't run," Isolde said finally, her voice cutting, through the silence that had stretched between them for hours. "Not from this. Too many people will die if we choose our own safety over their lives." Alaric nodded slowly, his fingers tracing patterns on the stone floor where his blood had once pooled. "I've been thinking the same thing. I've spent centuries avoiding conflict, telling myself that survival was the only honorable choice available to someone like me. But perhaps there comes a time when survival without purpose becomes its own form of death." When Father Benedict arrived with the dawn, they met him with a calm resolve that seemed to both surprise and reassure the elderly priest. "We'll help coordinate the evacuation," Isolde told him. "And Alaric will provide whatever testimony might expose this conspiracy. But," Alaric added with quiet determination, "we won't abandon our sanctuary. If the hunters want me, they can come here to claim me. At least that way, the battle happens on ground of our choosing." Benedict's weathered face showed a mixture of admiration and concern. "That's brave, but perhaps unwise. The forces gathering against you are considerable. Then help us prepare to meet them," Isolde interrupted. "We have advantages here: knowledge of the terrain, defensible positions, and allies who understand what we're fighting for. Running would only delay the inevitable while sacrificing those advantages." The priest studied them both carefully, noting the subtle changes in their bearing that spoke of a fundamental shift in how they viewed their situation. No longer refugees hiding from pursuit, they had become defenders preparing to make their stand. "Very well," he said finally. "I'll send word to our network contacts. How long do you need to prepare?" 2 days, Alaric replied without hesitation. "Long enough to set proper defenses and coordinate with whatever allies you can provide." As Benedict departed to make arrangements, Alaric led Isolde to a section of the abbey she had never fully explored, the old crypt beneath the altar where abbots had once been laid to rest. Hidden behind a stone that looked identical to all the others, he revealed a space that contained artifacts of his long existence. The most significant was a sword unlike any weapon Isolde had ever seen. The blade seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it, its surface marked with symbols that shifted and moved like living things. The crossguard was wrought silver, formed into shapes that suggested both protection and predation, while the grip was wrapped in leather so old it had taken on the texture of stone. "I forged this during the vampire wars of the 13th century, Alaric explained, lifting the weapon with reverent care. "It was meant to be a tool of peace capable of ending conflicts quickly, rather than prolonging suffering. I had hoped never to draw it again. But now you will. Now I must." He held the sword before him, and Isolde could feel the power that radiated from the ancient weapon, not malevolent, but terrible in its focused purpose. This blade can cut through supernatural defenses, disrupt magical protections, and harm beings that conventional weapons cannot touch. If the hunters bring supernatural allies against us, this will be our best defense. Watching him handle the weapon revealed aspects of his nature that their quiet weeks together had only hinted at. This was not just a healer and craftsman who had learned to fight, but a warrior who had chosen healing, someone who understood violence intimately enough to know when it was necessary and how to apply it with precision rather than cruelty. "What do you need me to do?" Isolde asked. "Learn to defend yourself without depending on my protection," he replied, then softened the harsh words with a gentle smile. "You've spent your life healing, but the next few days will require different skills. I can teach you enough to survive what's coming, but only if you're willing to embrace capabilities you've never needed before." The training that followed pushed Isolde beyond every boundary she had imagined for herself. Alaric taught her to move silently through the abbey's corridors, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated hidden enemies, and to use everyday objects as weapons when conventional options weren't available. More challenging was learning to access her own supernatural potential. The healing work they had done together had awakened abilities that went beyond conventional medicine. She could sense life force, direct healing energy, and even provide protection against certain forms of magical attack. Every human possesses some capacity for supernatural interaction, Alaric explained, as they practiced in the abbey's main hall. Most never develop it because they don't need to, but crisis can awaken remarkable abilities in those who have the courage to embrace them. Is that what happened when I healed the Miller child? Some kind of supernatural awakening? That was your true nature asserting itself, he corrected. You've always possessed this potential, your family's healing tradition, your ability to work with my grandmother's remedies, even your decision to help me despite every rational reason to fear what I am. You're not becoming something different, Isolde. You're becoming more fully yourself. As they worked together, preparing defenses and training for combat, their relationship deepened in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with partnership. They moved through the abbey's spaces with increasing coordination, anticipating each other's needs and responses with the intuitive understanding of those who trust completely. On the second day, Father Benedict returned with news that both encouraged and terrified. "I've contacted 3 network sanctuaries within a day's travel. They're sending what help they can, perhaps a dozen fighters with experience in supernatural combat, plus supplies and additional weapons. But the forces gathering against you are considerable. How considerable? Alaric asked. At least 30 hunters, possibly more, plus supernatural allies whose capabilities are unknown. They're being led by Archbishop Matthias himself, the architect of the entire purification campaign. Benedict's expression was grave. This isn't just an operation to capture you. It's designed to be a demonstration of church power that will discourage future resistance. The scope of what they faced would have been daunting under any circumstances, but it also clarified the stakes in ways that strengthened their resolve. This wasn't just about their survival anymore, it was about whether the network's mission of protecting the innocent could continue in the face of organized persecution. What about evidence? Isolde asked. If Alaric provides testimony about the conspiracy, will it matter if we don't survive to deliver it? I've prepared documents that will be dispatched to sympathetic bishops and secular authorities regardless of the outcome here, Benedict assured her. Your stand will not be forgotten, and your testimony will not be lost, even if... He paused, unable to complete the thought. Even if we don't survive to see justice done, Alaric finished calmly. That's acceptable, as long as the truth reaches those who can act upon it. That evening, as they made final preparations for what would likely be their last night of peace, Isolde found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. 6 weeks earlier, she had been a solitary healer, living quietly with her memories and her herbs. Now, she was preparing for battle alongside a being she had come to love, fighting for principles that would have seemed impossibly abstract before she witnessed the cost of abandoning them. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked Alaric, as they sat together in the space where their relationship had begun. "The choice to, trust me, to stay and fight instead of seeking safety elsewhere. The only thing I regret," he said, taking her hand in his, "is that we didn't have more time to explore what we might have become together. Everything else, the danger, the conflict, even the possibility of death, feels like a fair price for having known what we've shared." Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching rain and the distant sound of horses moving through the forest. The hunters were positioning themselves for their final assault, and morning would bring either victory or the end of everything they had built together. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Isolde said, "I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest I've known since Marcus died. You've given me back something I thought was lost forever." "You've given me far more than that," Alaric replied. "You've given me a reason to hope that redemption is possible, even for someone with my history." They spent the remaining hours in quiet conversation, sharing stories and memories that would become their legacy, regardless of whether they survived to create new ones. As the storm clouds gathered overhead, they prepared to meet whatever dawn would bring, united by love and sustained by the knowledge that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. Dawn broke grey and threatening, with storm clouds gathering like an omen of the violence to come. Isolde stood at the abbey's highest window, the bell tower that had once called monks to prayer and now served as their watchtower, scanning the forest for signs of approaching enemies. The ancient bronze bell hung silent above her, its voice long since stilled by time and abandonment. "They're coming from 3 directions," Alaric called softly from below, his supernatural senses detecting movement long before human eyes could perceive it. "At least 40 mounted figures, plus foot soldiers moving through the underbrush. They mean to surround us. Completely." The network allies, Father Benedict had promised, arrived just as the first hunters emerged from the tree line. 12 fighters, both human and supernatural, armed with weapons that gleamed with more than mere steel. Their leader, a stern woman named Catherine, who moved with the controlled grace of a reformed demon, surveyed the abbey's defenses with professional assessment. "The stonework will provide good cover," she announced, "but we can't hold the entire perimeter with so few defenders. We'll need to fall back in stages, using the building's layout to force them into bottlenecks." Isolde descended from the bell tower with her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she checked her supplies one final time. healing potions for their allies, protective wards learned from her grandmother's texts, and the small silver knife that Alaric had taught her to use with deadly precision when necessary. The first assault came with the rising sun, a coordinated attack designed to test their defenses and identify weaknesses. Crossbow bolts whistled through broken windows, while hunters on horseback circled the abbey like wolves, testing a fortified position. Alaric moved through the battle with fluid grace, his ancient sword singing through the air as it turned aside weapons and cut through armor as if it were parchment. But even his supernatural speed couldn't be everywhere at once, and their defensive line began to compress under relentless pressure. "The east wall is failing," Catherine shouted over the clash of weapons and the screams of wounded fighters. "We need to fall back to the inner sanctuary." The retreat through the abbey's corridors became a running battle, with defenders using every advantage the ancient building provided. Narrow doorways became killing grounds, winding staircases turned into defensive positions, and the maze-like layout of monastic quarters confused attackers who had expected straightforward assault, but the hunters had come prepared for extended siege. As Isolde helped drag a wounded network fighter to safety, she caught sight of their true enemy for the first time, Archbishop Matthias himself, a tall figure in elaborate robes who directed the assault with the cold calculation of someone who viewed violence as a necessary tool of divine will. Beside him stood a being that made her blood freeze. Pale as winter snow, but moving with predatory grace that spoke of supernatural heritage, the figure wore the robes of a church official, but possessed eyes that glowed with inner fire. This was one of the detection specialists Benedict had warned them about, a supernatural being who had chosen to hunt its own kind in service to human authority. "They've brought a true hunter," Alaric said grimly, following her gaze. "Someone with abilities that match or exceed my own. This changes the tactical situation considerably." Their defensive perimeter continued to shrink as the day wore on. Brave network fighters fell despite their supernatural allies, and the hunters pressed their advantage with methodical persistence. By mid-afternoon, the surviving defenders had been driven back to the abbey's central hall, the sacred space where Isolde had first tended Alaric's wounds and where their relationship had begun. "The bell tower," Alaric said during a brief lull in the fighting. "It's our most defensible position, with only one approach route and stone walls thick enough to withstand prolonged assault." Catherine nodded grimly. "But it's also a trap. Once we're up there, there's no retreat." "Then we make our stand count," Isolde replied, surprised by the calm authority in her own voice. "If we're going to be cornered, let it be in a place that means something." The climb to the bell tower became a fighting retreat up narrow stone steps that had been worn smooth by centuries of monastic feet. Each landing provided a brief defensive position where they could hold off pursuit, but the hunters pressed upward with relentless determination. Halfway up the tower, disaster struck. Catherine fell with a crossbow bolt through her chest, her reformed demon physiology not quite enough to shrug off a weapon blessed with holy power. 2 more network fighters died attempting to protect her retreat, their sacrifice buying precious moments for the others to reach the bell chamber. In the tower's highest room, surrounded by the massive bronze bell and ancient wooden framework that had once regulated monastic life, the surviving defenders prepared for what might be their final battle. Through the narrow windows, Isolde could see Archbishop Matthias positioning his forces for a final assault, his supernatural ally crouched beside him like a hunting cat ready to spring. "They'll demand surrender first," Alaric predicted, checking the edge of his blade with practiced efficiency. "Matthias wants me alive to provide information about network operations and dissident, supernatural safe houses. And when we refuse, then they'll come up those stairs with everything they have, and we'll discover whether love and courage are truly stronger than hatred and superior numbers." Below them, a voice rang out with the authority of ecclesiastical power. "Alaric of the northern clans, you are commanded to surrender yourself for judgment." Come forth peacefully, and your human allies will be spared." Isolde moved to the window, her hand finding Alaric's as they looked down at their enemies together. "What do we tell them?" Alaric smiled, the same warm expression that had first made her heart skip when he was barely more than a wounded stranger. "We tell them that some sanctuaries are worth defending, regardless of the cost." The defiant silence that met Archbishop Matthias's demand for surrender lasted only moments before the thunder of boots on stone announced the final assault. Isolde pressed herself against the bell tower's ancient walls, feeling the vibrations of armed men climbing toward their sanctuary with murderous intent. "They're bringing the supernatural hunter up first," Alaric observed, his storm-grey eyes tracking movement beyond the narrow windows. "He'll try to neutralize me while the human soldiers deal with everyone else." From her healer's bag, Isolde withdrew something she had hoped never to use, a small silver reliquary that had belonged to her grandmother, containing what family legend claimed was a fragment of wood from the true cross. Whether the relic's power was genuine or simply the product of faith made manifest, it possessed the ability to compel absolute honesty from any being that came within its influence. "What are you planning?" Alaric asked, noting the reverent way she handled the ancient artifact. "To end this with truth instead of violence, if possible," she replied, though her other hand remained firmly gripped around the silver knife he had taught her to use. "If Matthias really believes he serves divine will, let him confront what that will actually demands." The first figure to emerge through the tower's entrance was indeed the supernatural hunter, a being whose pale beauty was marred by eyes that held no trace of warmth or mercy. It moved with liquid grace that spoke of vampire heritage, but its allegiance to the church had twisted that supernatural nature into something fundamentally corrupt. "Alaric," it spoke, its voice carrying the musical quality common to their species. "You have caused considerable inconvenience with your stubborn refusal to cooperate. That ends now." The battle that erupted between the two supernatural beings was unlike anything Isolde had witnessed during their defensive retreat. They moved faster than human eyes could follow, their clash ringing against the bell tower's stones with the sound of steel meeting steel. But where Alaric fought with controlled precision, seeking to disable rather than destroy, his opponent attacked with vicious intent to cause maximum suffering. Archbishop Matthias appeared in the doorway as his supernatural ally pressed Alaric back toward the massive bell, crossbow trained on Isolde with the clear threat that any interference would result in her immediate death. "Enough!" the Archbishop commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Surrender now, and I give you my word that the woman's death will be quick rather than prolonged." "Your word," Isolde said, stepping forward despite the crossbow aimed at her heart. "Spoken by someone who poisons children to achieve his political objectives. Let's see what your word is actually worth." She held up the silver reliquary, its surface catching the morning light that streamed through the tower windows. The effect on both attackers was immediate and dramatic. The supernatural hunter stumbled mid-strike, suddenly unable to maintain the focused aggression that had been driving its assault, while Matthias himself went rigid with obvious discomfort. "What are you doing?" the Archbishop demanded, but his voice now carried uncertainty rather than command. "Compelling truth," Isolde replied calmly. "This relic has the power to strip away lies and self-deception, leaving only honest intention. If you truly serve divine will, you should welcome its influence." The supernatural hunter tried to retreat toward the stairs, but found itself unable to move beyond the relic's range of influence. "Master," it gasped, "I cannot, the compulsion is too strong." "Tell us about the conspiracy," Alaric commanded, pressing his advantage as his opponent's supernatural abilities faltered under the relic's power. "Tell us about the agreements between vampire lords and church officials." "The conclave of shadows," the hunter spoke against its obvious will, the words torn from its throat by supernatural compulsion. Lord Drackle and his allies met with Archbishop Matthias 6 months ago. They offered information about independent supernatural beings in exchange for protection from persecution and expanded feeding territories. Lies, Matthias snarled, but the relic's influence was working on him as well, forcing honesty despite his desire for concealment. Not lies, the hunter continued, its voice growing stronger as the truth took hold. The plan was to eliminate supernatural beings who refused to acknowledge vampire authority, creating a hierarchy that served both church and undead nobility. I was promised redemption for my participation, but I see now that I was merely a tool to be discarded once my usefulness ended. The weight of this confession struck Archbishop Matthias like a physical blow. Under the relic's influence, he could no longer maintain the self-righteousness that had justified his actions. It was necessary, he said, but the words came out hollow and unconvincing. Order required, control demanded. Children died because of your political arrangements, Isolde stated with quiet fury. Innocent people suffered while you consolidated power. Where is the divine will in that? For a moment, genuine anguish flickered across the Archbishop's features as the relic forced him to confront the true nature of his choices. But then his face hardened with desperate resolve, and he raised his crossbow toward the silver reliquary in her hands. I will not be judged by artifacts and abominations, he declared, his finger tightening on the trigger. The crossbow bolt never reached its target. Alaric's ancient sword, thrown with supernatural precision, struck the weapon from Matthias's hands an instant before the reformed hunter, freed from its corrupted loyalties by the relic's truth, turned on its former master with predatory fury. Justice, the hunter whispered, as it advanced on the Archbishop with movements that spoke of centuries of suppressed rage. For what you made me do, for what you made me become. What followed was swift and final. When the sounds of struggle faded, only truth remained in the bell tower's ancient space. Truth about conspiracy and corruption, about redemption and justice, and about the power of love to transform even the most desperate circumstances. Below them, the remaining hunters had heard enough testimony to understand that their holy mission had been built on lies. Some fled immediately, while others threw down their weapons in disgust. The battle was over, decided not by superior force, but by the simple power of honesty to expose evil masquerading as righteousness. As morning light streamed through the tower windows, Isolde and Alaric found themselves standing together in the space where church bells had once called the faithful to prayer, surrounded by the evidence that truth, however painful, ultimately served justice better than any sword. 3 months after the confrontation in the bell tower, St. Agatha's Abbey had been transformed from a forgotten ruin into something unprecedented, a sanctuary that bridged the gap between human and supernatural communities with the blessing of Reformed church authorities and the protection of secular law. The testimony extracted by the sacred relic had indeed reached sympathetic bishops and government officials, triggering investigations that exposed the full extent of corruption within the cleansing hand. Archbishop Matthias's conspiracy with vampire nobility had been only the beginning of a network that extended throughout the church hierarchy, trading persecution for political advantage and personal enrichment. Father Benedict, elevated to Bishop Benedict in recognition of his network's crucial role in exposing the truth, now oversaw a new ecclesiastical policy that evaluated supernatural beings by their actions rather than their nature. The reformed hunter who had delivered justice in the bell tower had become his most trusted advisor, working to establish protocols for peaceful coexistence between species that had been enemies for centuries. But for Isolde, the most meaningful transformation was far more personal. She stood in the Abbey's rebuilt workshop, watching Alaric put the finishing touches on a project that had occupied him for weeks. 2 simple rings crafted from silver and gold, designed not for legal marriage, but for a spiritual commitment that transcended the boundaries of conventional ceremony. "The silver comes from my broken amulet," he explained, holding up the delicate bands to catch the afternoon light streaming through new windows. The gold was a gift from the village blacksmith, who insisted on contributing to what he called the abbey's happiness. "They're not perfect, but they're made from materials that represent both our pasts and our hopes for the future." Thomas, now nearly 17 and serving as the abbey's official messenger, peered over Alaric's shoulder with obvious fascination. "They're beautiful work, sir. Lady Isolde will be pleased." The boy had adapted to the abbey's transformation with the resilience of youth, accepting the presence of supernatural refugees with the same matter-of-fact approach he brought to all of life's complexities. His mother had initially worried about his exposure to such influences, but watching him thrive in an environment where his peculiar perceptions were valued rather than feared had convinced her that some changes were worth embracing. The ceremony that blessed their union took place at sunset, in the garden where Isolde had once tended herbs alone and now cultivated medicines that served both human and supernatural patients. Bishop Benedict performed the ritual with words that honored both ancient tradition and present necessity, while witnesses included villagers, network members, and supernatural beings who had found sanctuary within the abbey's protective embrace. "Love," Benedict said as they exchanged rings crafted from silver and gold, "is the force that transforms enemies into allies, strangers into family, and fear into understanding. What we celebrate today is not just the union of two souls, but the promise that such transformation is possible for all who possess the courage to embrace it." Alaric's hands were warm, despite his supernatural nature, as he slipped the ring onto Isolde's finger, and his storm-grey eyes held the kind of peace she had never expected to see in someone who had carried such burdens for so long. "I promise," he said, speaking vows they had written together during quiet evenings by the fire, "to honor both your independence and our partnership, to support your healing work as you have supported my redemption, and to build with you a sanctuary that proves love is stronger than hatred." "I promise," Isolde replied, her voice steady despite the tears that blurred her vision, "to trust in the future we're creating together, to defend what we've built against those who would destroy it, and to demonstrate daily that mercy is not weakness, but the highest form of strength." The celebration that followed their ceremony was unlike anything the abbey had ever witnessed, humans and supernatural beings sharing food and stories, former enemies discovering common ground, and children playing games that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier. As the evening deepened and their guests gradually departed for homes throughout the valley, Isolde and Alaric found themselves alone in the space where their relationship had begun. The altar, where she had first tended his wounds, now served as the foundation for their new life together, surrounded by books that contained both ancient wisdom and contemporary knowledge, tools that bridged human craft with supernatural capability. "Do you ever wonder what Marcus would think of all this?" Alaric asked, settling beside her on the cushioned bench they had placed near the spot where he had nearly died. "I think he would be proud," Isolde replied after careful consideration. "Not because I found love again, but because I found the courage to build something larger than my own comfort and safety." "And what of your children? Do you think they would approve of their mother sharing her life with someone like me?" "I think they would love you," she said with certainty that surprised them both. "They had generous hearts and curious minds. They would see what I see, someone who chooses compassion over convenience, creation over destruction, hope over despair." Outside, the night was filled with sounds that spoke of life continuing in all its complex forms. In the village, families slept peacefully for the first time in months. In the forest, supernatural beings moved freely, without fear of persecution. And in the abbey, two souls who had found each other across impossible circumstances, prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring. "What happens next?" Isolde asked, settling against Alaric's shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of those who had earned their peace through shared struggle. "Next, he replied, his arm tightening around her with protective warmth. We live. We heal those who need healing, protect those who need protection, and prove every day that the world we've imagined is possible to create. Together, she agreed, the word carrying the weight of commitment and the lightness of joy in equal measure. Together, he confirmed, and the way he said it made their joined future seem not just possible, but inevitable. Above them, the abbey's restored bell tower stood sentinel against the stars, its bronze bell ready to call the faithful to prayer once more, prayers for understanding, for redemption, and for the continued transformation of a world where love had proven stronger than the longest hatred.